No topic rings quite as despondent as death. For centuries, the idea of death has been explored over and over again in art, especially when it comes to music. Even back when Schubert was writing operas, he was still using death as some kind of prompt or idea to base his music on. And even if you fast forward to the modern age, death is still a prominent topic. And there are many cases where death is used as a concept or as a means of introspection. But then there's the new Mount Eerie album, A Crow Looked at Me. Mount Eerie is the musical project led by singer-songwriter and multi-instrumentalist Phil Alvarin, who was also previously known for leading the other musical project, The Microphones. Both The Microphones and Mount Eerie were renowned for their beautifully rough, autumnal, lo-fi, perfectly imperfect approach to indie folk music. And of course, death has also been a topic covered by Mount Eerie and The Microphones in the past. But this new album from Mount Eerie, A Crow Looked at Me, is different because, to put this record into context, and this is kind of the clincher when it comes to this album, A Crow Looked at Me is an album following the passing of Phil's wife Genevieve, and everything on the album has to do with this. Everything. There isn't a song on this album where her presence, or lack thereof, isn't mentioned or hinted at. And in many ways this can come as a real emotional clincher, as the lyrics seem to just be describing situations or symbols or sights and feelings and thoughts. There are moments where he's just describing things he sees, and somehow these can be triggers for memories, or maybe in some way they just remind him of Genevieve. To give an example that grabbed me personally, the track Toothbrush Trash describes the sound of the bathroom door closing behind Phil. So he turns around to see if anyone is there, but no one is there. It was just the October wind shutting the door. Now, this seems like a very simple scenario to describe, but actually the implication there is just so powerfully devastating. You really get that little split-second feeling of hope, maybe disillusioned hope, where he's kind of turning around hoping that someone is there. And it just goes to show how the aftermath of a close one's passing can really bleed slowly into someone's everyday routine. The same idea is really brought up on the track When I Take the Garbage Out at Night. And I would say that this is such an artful way of tackling the age-old concept of death, but actually it seems like this album really wants to be as unartful about the concept of death as possible. Maybe I shouldn't even say the word concept, because whilst death is definitely an underlying theme on this album, Phil seems to want to avoid to fantasize this or poeticize this, because if you look at the track Emptiness Part 2, Phil says, conceptualizing death was cool until I walked through those hospital halls. It's such a chilling line, but it really just references the fact that we can always use death as a means of introspection or self-exploration or self-expression, education. But at the end of the day, death is such a real, scary, unforgiving, inevitable thing. It impacts people. It impacts people close to those people. The very first line of this album is, "Death is real," followed by, "It's not for writing about when real death enters the room, all poetry is dumb." Now that Phil is in a mindset or situation involving the passing of a loved one, it's only served as a reminder of how unforgiving and despondent death is in actuality. We may conceptualize it, fantasize it, turn it into some kind of metaphor, or explore it for the sake of just self-expression. Which is all fine and good. Some of the best art has resulted from it. But in a real-life situation involving death, the purpose for poetry seems to fade, at least for Phil. Everything on here is direct, blunt, every feeling and thought is unfiltered. So in a way, this is kind of like a sonic document of where Phil is at, or where Phil was at, around the time when he was most affected. And as such, it is kind of hard for me to look at this album and critique it normally, because it seems like everything on this album is just so real. And instrumentally, this album isn't even making a spectacle of itself, because it's just such a gentle, acoustic folk record, feeling so cold and static, like the world is frozen still or is in slow motion, and there's so little to do or to say anymore that could be, meaningful, or at least could feel meaningful. There are just moments where you just kind of feel so lost for words. There is some musical variance, but it's very subtle, like the piano on Emptiness Part 2, or the distorted guitar hanging in the background on Soria Moria. But overall, this thing is just very unsuspecting and gentle, and just skeletal. And that may be a turn-off for some people who would expect something a little more instrumentally rich, for example, but that really isn't the aim of this record. If anything, I really think that this stripped-down instrumental sound actually fits what Phil is going for. So, sometimes, like on the track Ravens, for example, it does feel like Phil is just sitting down with an acoustic guitar and just playing as he just says a whole bunch of thoughts just coming off the top of his head, recounting distant memories or recounting what's happening right now, talking about the things that he sees and what the things he sees reminds him of. The instrumental bareness is bringing to the forefront Phil's very personal, pained lyrics. And this album's presentation of death includes its long-lasting aftermath, even if, towards the very end, or even at the very start, Phil doesn't seem to want to make death the only thing that you take away from this album. Even if it is kind of the message of the album that death is real, just blatantly death is real. It's the first line of the album. It's what sticks with you once you've finished it. But when he ends the album off with a very chilling, somewhat touching little notion of seeing a crow staring at him, and in this crow he sees an image of his own wife. He finally manages to visualize his wife kind of staring back at him. You know, the proclamation of "I saw her" is touching, but there is also that implied emptiness, that implied sadness there. Like there's this disconnect there. But perhaps there is this desire to remember just Genevieve. The very last line of the first track, Real Death, is blatantly, "I don't want to learn anything from this, I love you." There's just so much on this album that's going through distant memories, and I would like to go into a whole load of the lyrics, but all I can do is just say a couple of highlights, because there's just so much to dig into on this album. Moments where he's watching the sunset, and he's comparing the sunset to his own wife. Or the moment on My Chasm, where he's talking about how other people get uncomfortable when he brings up Genevieve in conversation, rendering him unable to kind of bring up his wife, even though he kind of wants to. Where places even as daily as supermarkets are becoming kind of just caves of sadness for him. Honestly, I find it difficult to fault this album for too much. You know, it's not an accessible album by any means. I mean, I wish I could say it was, but it really isn't. It's not an easy listen, both instrumentally and lyrically. But it really is one of the most elaborate and uncompromising albums about death that I've listened to, if not the most. There's just a beauty to the way Phil puts these blatant words into musical form. It's not an album in the traditional sense, and the musical deliverance of the unfiltered, untampered feelings and events following the death of a close one is something beyond usual expectations and tropes. And by the end of it, there isn't so much a satisfying ending. And even if the content of this album is very personal to Phil Elverum, there's still a means of me connecting to what he's saying, because what he's saying about death is just so universal. And very few albums have brought me to that mental state where I can't bring myself to react in any way, just out of feeling purely just exhausted emotionally, very devastated. You know, I can't cry, I can't smirk, can't do anything but just sit, listen, and think as the world continues to move on around me. I'm going to give this album a 10 out of 10.